Jake Miller had lived on his sprawling ranch for more than 20 years, and in all that time, life had been predictably calm. His mornings began with the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. The land stretched for miles, dotted with weathered barns, fences that had stood for decades, and a mailbox that had faithfully received letters, bills, and the occasional greeting card from friends and neighbors. Jake prided himself on keeping things simple: hard work, a little tinkering in his workshop, and quiet days filled with the rhythms of ranch life. He had seen seasons change, storms batter his fences, and even the occasional car veer too close to his driveway, but nothing had ever threatened his mailbox. That is, until the HOA patrol started making their rounds. It began subtly. On a bright Tuesday morning, Jake walked out to check his mail, expecting the usual stack of letters and advertisements. Instead, he found his mailbox lying in the dirt, twisted and dented, the post cracked at the base. He squinted at the familiar white box, now ruined, and shook his head. "Must have been an accident," he muttered. A neighbor's truck had probably clipped it while turning around. He hefted the mailbox back onto its post, hammered a few nails, and told himself it was no big deal. The next Tuesday, the same thing happened. This time, the mailbox wasn't just cracked, it was crushed. The wooden post splintered, metal bent at unnatural angles. Jake felt his blood pressure spike. He measured the distance from the road, 18 inches, exactly the Postal Service requirement. "I can't control other people," he reminded himself, but a gnawing sense of unease settled in his chest. By the fifth Tuesday, whatever hope he had that these incidents were accidental had vanished. The mailbox destruction had become routine, relentless, and deliberate. Jake knew he was being targeted, and the realization angered him. He wasn't just a rancher, he was a retired engineer. He knew how things worked, how forces interacted, how to make structures stand against impact. And he had a stubborn streak a mile wide. The day he decided to confront the problem, Jake called the HOA office. He had spent a few minutes straightening himself, rehearsing what he would say. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. "Mr. Miller," a polite but clipped voice said. "How can we help you today?" "It's my mailbox," Jake replied. "Again. It's destroyed. I need an explanation." There was a pause. "Our patrol vehicles need adequate clearance for safety inspections of the community," the voice said finally, calm and official. Jake gritted his teeth. "I've measured it myself. 18 inches from the road, exactly like the Postal Service requires. Nothing has changed." There was another pause, then a soft sigh. "Well, accidents happen. You know, vehicles sometimes miscalculate." Jake hung up, muttering under his breath. He had replaced his mailbox 7 times by now. 7 times. And each time, he thought, next week, it'll happen again. He looked at his old mailbox lying in the dirt, splintered and broken, and something clicked. Enough was enough. He walked into his workshop, a place cluttered with tools, metal scraps, and half-finished projects. The smell of oil and sawdust filled the air. For weeks, Jake worked quietly, welding, calculating, and designing something special. The mailbox he envisioned would look exactly like the ordinary metal boxes that dotted ranches and suburban streets, but inside, it would be a fortress. Steel I-beams would anchor the post 3 feet deep in concrete. The mailbox itself would be reinforced with a hidden steel frame. And, for good measure, he installed a tiny, solar-powered camera disguised as a decorative birdhouse nearby. Motion-activated, it would capture everything the patrol did. Jake worked late into the night, welding sparks flying, blueprints scattered across the workbench. His neighbors saw the occasional flash of light from his windows but had no idea what was going on inside. He smiled quietly to himself. This wasn't just about a mailbox anymore, it was about sending a message. Not with words, not with confrontation, but with ingenuity. Finally, after weeks of preparation, the new mailbox stood ready. To the casual observer, it was the same simple black metal box on a wooden post as always. But Jake knew the truth. He leaned against the fence, coffee in hand, and gazed at his creation. The anticipation bubbled beneath his calm exterior. He wondered how long it would take before the patrol returned. He hoped it would be Tuesday morning. Tuesday arrived, the sky a crisp blue, the ranch bathed in soft morning light. Jake watched from his kitchen window, eyes trained on the long stretch of road leading to his property. The familiar white patrol truck appeared around the bend. Its driver, confident as always, eased the vehicle closer to the mailbox, unaware of what awaited. Jake's heart beat faster, not with fear, but with satisfaction. The moment he had engineered for had finally come. And so, after 2 decades of quiet ranch life, a relentless HOA patrol, and 7 destroyed mailboxes, Jake Miller prepared to face his final test. The calm rancher was gone. In his place stood a man who had turned patience, skill, and intelligence into a silent, unyielding fortress. Tuesday morning arrived with a crispness that made the ranch air feel electric. Jake Miller stood behind his kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the familiar stretch of road that led to his property. For weeks, he had prepared for this moment, the culmination of patience, calculation, and more than a little quiet revenge. The mailbox outside, ordinary in appearance, hid a fortress of steel and concrete that even the most determined patrol vehicle could not destroy. The white HOA patrol truck rounded the bend, its tires crunching over the gravel driveway. The driver, a man who had made this weekly routine into a ritual, slowed slightly as he approached Jake's mailbox. He had a confident air, a subtle smirk as he steered the truck toward the familiar target. To him, it was just another mailbox to clip, another resident to intimidate. Jake sipped his coffee calmly, his eyes never leaving the approaching truck. He could see the driver's posture, the casual way he eased his foot onto the accelerator as he neared the post. In previous weeks, this routine had ended with shattered wood, bent metal, and Jake cursing under his breath. But today, everything would be different. The truck hit the mailbox with a sound that made Jake's ears perk up, a deafening clang that echoed across the ranch. The front bumper crumpled instantly, metal groaning under the hidden strength of the reinforced steel post. Sparks flew as the impact scraped the I-beam hidden inside the post. The driver's eyes widened, and for the first time, confidence turned to confusion. He hit the brakes hard, tires skidding on the gravel, leaving deep marks that cut across the driveway. Jake leaned closer to the window, watching the man's reaction. The patrol driver sat frozen behind the wheel, hands gripping the steering wheel as though it might somehow help him comprehend what had just happened. Slowly, with a hesitation born of disbelief, he reversed the truck, the engine emitting a troubling grinding noise that made it clear repairs would be necessary. From his vantage point, Jake could see the subtle shudder in the truck as it rolled backward. And then, with the faintest hint of irony, the mailbox didn't even wobble. Not a dent. Not a scratch. It stood resolute, the product of weeks of engineering and determination. An hour later, the doorbell rang. Jake's hand lingered on the handle, a small smile playing across his face. When he opened the door, the HOA president stood there, flanked by 2 board members. The trio's expressions carried that familiar mix of indignation and disbelief. "Mr. Miller," the president began, voice tight, "our patrol vehicle was damaged this morning." Jake nodded sympathetically, feigning concern. "That's unfortunate," he said. "Did it hit something?" The president's gaze flicked to the mailbox, and for a moment, the air was thick with tension. "Your mailbox, it appears to be unusually sturdy," he admitted, though the words sounded begrudging even to him. Jake reached into his pocket and produced a small folder of documentation. Blueprints, measurements, and regulatory compliance papers were neatly organized inside. "Everything's perfectly legal," Jake explained. "Regulation compliant, just like the Postal Service requires." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of the morning's events sinking in. They had believed this routine harassment could continue unchecked. They hadn't anticipated resistance, and certainly not resistance backed by engineering precision and ingenuity. Later that afternoon, Jake reviewed the footage captured by his hidden camera. The solar-powered birdhouse had recorded everything in crisp, clear detail. The HOA patrol had not been accidentally clipping mailboxes. They had been deliberately targeting them, part of what seemed to be a broader harassment campaign against residents who had dared to question authority. The evidence was irrefutable. Jake didn't release the footage publicly. He didn't need to. Instead, he quietly shared it with his neighbors, ensuring they knew the truth behind the seemingly routine patrols. He also sent a copy to the postal inspector, guaranteeing that the illegal targeting of compliant mailboxes could not continue unchecked. Justice had been served quietly, without spectacle, but with undeniable authority. As the sun began to set over the ranch, Jake leaned against the post of his unyielding mailbox and watched the light shift across the fields. There was a satisfaction in knowing that intelligence and patience could triumph over arrogance and overreach. He had turned a simple piece of everyday property into a symbol, a quiet testament that careful preparation, clever design, and calm determination could stand up to even the most persistent forces of authority. Jake smiled to himself. The ranch was peaceful again, the mailbox intact, and the HOA patrol had learned a lesson they wouldn't forget. It wasn't about destruction or revenge. It was about proving that, sometimes, the quietest person in the room can be the most formidable. For the first time in weeks, Jake felt a sense of calm settle over the ranch. He knew that, for now, his property, and his principles, were safe. The mailbox stood like a sentinel at the edge of his land, a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and the quiet power of standing one's ground. And somewhere down the road, the patrol driver nursed a dented bumper and a bruised ego, a subtle reminder that not all battles are won with force. Some are won with patience, cleverness, and a well-engineered plan. The morning after the incident, Jake Miller walked outside with a calmness that only comes from knowing the scales had finally tipped in one's favor. The ranch basked in early sunlight, the grass sparkling with dew, and the mailbox, his unyielding creation, stood tall and silent at the edge of the driveway. It looked ordinary enough, but Jake knew better. Inside that seemingly simple post lay steel and concrete, a testament to patience, preparation, and quiet ingenuity. The HOA patrol had been conspicuously absent that morning, which brought a wry smile to Jake's face. News of the damaged vehicle likely spread quickly through their ranks, and now they were hesitant, unsure how to approach the ranch after the previous day's spectacular failure. Jake knew they wouldn't try the same stunt again anytime soon. They had learned a lesson in humility, though they didn't realize it was a lesson taught by a mailbox rather than confrontation. Still, Jake wasn't about to let the situation fade into ambiguity. He wanted the truth to be known, not as a public spectacle, but as a quiet, undeniable warning. The hidden camera he had installed inside the birdhouse had captured everything, the patrol truck deliberately accelerating toward the mailbox, the impact, and the stunned reaction of the driver. The footage was crystal clear, a perfect record of the harassment campaign the HOA had orchestrated against residents who dared to question them. He began making discreet copies. One folder went to his immediate neighbors, those he knew had quietly grumbled about similar experiences with HOA overreach. He wrote a simple note: "The mailbox is just a symbol. But the evidence is real. Be aware, and protect yourselves." His neighbors were grateful, whispering thanks and exchanging knowing glances, realizing that Jake had quietly taken up a mantle none of them had dared. Next, Jake sent another copy to the postal inspector. Unlike the HOA, the Postal Service had authority that could not be ignored. The inspector reviewed the footage, nodded in approval, and assured Jake that steps would be taken to ensure compliance and safety. By documenting deliberate damage to a legally compliant mailbox, Jake had not only protected himself but had also created a chain of accountability that the HOA could not dismiss. Meanwhile, the HOA president called again, his tone more cautious than the previous confrontation. "Mr. Miller, I understand your mailbox withstood our patrol vehicle," he began, careful not to sound accusatory. "I want to clarify that our intention was never to harass. Accidents happen." Jake listened politely, his calm demeanor masking the satisfaction he felt. "I understand," he replied evenly. "But as you can see from my documentation, everything is compliant with postal regulations. I hope this ensures there will be no further accidents." The president paused, perhaps realizing the futility of arguing against clear evidence. He mumbled something about reviewing patrol procedures and hung up. Jake smiled faintly. The HOA had been forced to back down, their authority subtly undermined by clever preparation rather than confrontation. In the days that followed, life on the ranch returned to a peaceful rhythm. Neighbors who had suffered under similar harassment began to feel emboldened, inspired by Jake's ingenuity. No one dared approach his mailbox recklessly again. The once menacing patrol truck was now a cautionary tale, its dented bumper serving as a silent monument to overconfidence. Jake spent time in his workshop again, though now with less urgency. He tinkered with small projects, repaired equipment, and occasionally checked the mailbox camera footage to ensure nothing untoward was happening. The experience had taught him a valuable lesson: patience, preparation, and clever thinking could accomplish more than confrontation or anger ever could. One afternoon, as Jake leaned against the reinforced post of his mailbox, watching the sunlight shift across the fields, he reflected on the ordeal. He realized it wasn't just about protecting property. It was about standing up to authority in a way that preserved dignity, intelligence, and patience. His mailbox had become a symbol of quiet resistance, a reminder that compliance with the law doesn't mean submission to unjust power. For Jake, justice wasn't about retaliation. It was about making a statement that careful planning, ingenuity, and calm resolve can triumph over arrogance and overreach. And in a world where bureaucratic power often seemed overwhelming, it was a small but satisfying victory. As the ranch settled into the soft glow of evening, Jake's mailbox stood proud and unyielding. The birds returned to the nearby birdhouse, unaware of the hidden camera within, while the sun cast long shadows across the fields. Somewhere down the road, the HOA patrol driver nursed a bruised ego, a dented bumper, and a lesson he wouldn't forget. Jake sipped his coffee, now lukewarm but comforting, and let out a quiet laugh. Life on the ranch was peaceful again, the mailbox intact, and his neighbors reassured. Justice had been served, quietly, cleverly, and undeniably. And for Jake Miller, that was more than enough. In the days following the spectacular confrontation with the HOA patrol truck, life on Jake Miller's ranch returned to a deceptive calm. From the outside, nothing had changed. The mailbox looked the same as it always had, black metal gleaming faintly in the sun, a birdhouse perched nearby. But beneath that ordinary facade, a quiet revolution had occurred. Word traveled quickly among Jake's neighbors. Those who had silently suffered the HOA's overreach, arbitrary fines, constant inspections, and occasional property harassment, now whispered about the rancher who had turned the tables. Some came by to inspect the mailbox from a safe distance, marveling at its sturdy construction without realizing the full extent of Jake's engineering genius. "He really taught them a lesson," one neighbor muttered. "I just wish I'd thought of it first." Jake didn't boast. He answered questions politely, describing his mailbox as just reinforced a bit for safety and letting his calm demeanor speak louder than words. The real power lay in the evidence he had quietly collected, motion-activated video footage showing the HOA patrol deliberately targeting mailboxes. He shared copies with neighbors in sealed folders, accompanied by brief notes explaining the situation and advising vigilance. The effect was immediate. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt empowered. Residents began taking steps to protect their properties, checking compliance, documenting incidents, and quietly preparing for any future harassment. Jake's mailbox had become more than a structure; it was a symbol of resistance, a silent message that overreach and intimidation would not go unchallenged. The HOA, meanwhile, scrambled to regain credibility. The president and board members convened emergency meetings, trying to figure out how to respond to the public relations nightmare of a damaged patrol vehicle and a citizen exposing deliberate harassment. They issued vague statements about reviewing patrol procedures and ensuring safety, but residents were no longer willing to accept platitudes. Jake's foresight had shifted the balance of power, if only subtly, and the HOA knew it. One afternoon, Jake received a visit from the postal inspector who had reviewed his footage. The inspector was courteous but firm. "Mr. Miller," he said, glancing at the reinforced mailbox, "your documentation and evidence are impeccable. This puts the HOA on notice. They cannot target legally compliant mailboxes without consequence. Jake nodded. No words were needed, justice had been quietly enforced. Even the patrol driver who had collided with Jake's mailbox found himself under scrutiny. The incident was documented officially, and any future attempts at harassment would carry real consequences. For once, overconfidence met accountability. Jake found satisfaction in knowing that the system, slow, imperfect, but ultimately fair, had worked in his favor. As the weeks passed, Jake noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood. Residents repaired old fences, replaced sagging mailboxes with reinforced but visually ordinary ones, and kept discreet watch over their properties. Conversations that had once been hushed now carried a quiet tone of empowerment. People exchanged tips, measurements, and strategies, inspired by the rancher who had used intelligence instead of anger to confront authority. Jake continued to maintain his mailbox, occasionally checking the hidden camera footage to ensure that no mischief occurred. He felt a sense of calm pride. The mailbox was more than a protective measure, it was a statement of resilience and preparation. And yet, for all the attention it drew, it remained modest, unassuming, and perfectly in line with postal regulations. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, Jake sat on his porch with a warm drink in hand. He watched as neighbors went about their routines, unaware of the invisible lesson the mailbox had imparted. It wasn't about confrontation, revenge, or spectacle. It was about strategy, patience, and intelligent preparation. By standing firm in compliance and reinforcing his property quietly, Jake had ensured that justice was served without drama. The HOA, now cautious and hesitant, avoided unnecessary confrontations. Their patrols were more careful, respectful of regulations, and aware that residents were no longer passive targets. Jake's ingenuity had shifted the dynamic, intimidation no longer worked. Authority had been held accountable, subtly and undeniably. For Jake Miller, the lesson was simple yet profound. Strength wasn't always about force. Sometimes it was about foresight, patience, and clever planning. By transforming a simple mailbox into a symbol of resistance, he had preserved his property, inspired his neighbors, and ensured that fairness, even against stubborn bureaucracy, could prevail. As the night settled over the ranch, the mailbox stood quietly at the edge of the driveway, unbroken and unyielding, a sentinel of ingenuity and a silent guardian of the community's dignity. Jake smiled softly, sipping his drink. Life was peaceful again, but now, it carried a deeper sense of security and quiet triumph. The battle had been small, the stakes simple, but the impact was lasting. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The days turned into weeks, and life on Jake Miller's ranch settled into a rhythm that was both familiar and subtly transformed. The sun rose over the fields, cattle grazed lazily, and the wind whispered through the trees as if carrying a quiet message of triumph. The mailbox, Jake's masterpiece of engineering, stood proudly at the edge of the driveway. Its black metal exterior looked ordinary, but it had become something far greater, a symbol of resilience, cleverness, and quiet justice. Jake spent his mornings tending to the ranch, performing routine chores, and occasionally checking the hidden camera in the birdhouse nearby. It had captured everything: the deliberate harassment, the patrol truck's collision, the stunned expressions of the HOA patrol. But the footage was more than evidence, it was a reminder of what patience, ingenuity, and planning could achieve. The HOA, shaken by the events, had taken a cautious approach. Patrols were more careful, respectful of regulations, and notably absent from Jake's property. Word of his reinforced mailbox had spread quietly through the community, inspiring residents to protect their own properties and to document interactions with the HOA meticulously. The balance of power had shifted, subtly but undeniably. Neighbors came by occasionally, offering a nod or a word of thanks. One elderly rancher, who had been quietly fuming at HOA overreach for years, shook Jake's hand and said, "You showed us all that they can't push us around anymore. Clever thinking beats force every time." Jake smiled, modestly accepting the gratitude. It wasn't about being a hero, it was about standing up for what was right in a thoughtful, calculated way. Jake reflected on the journey that had begun with repeated destruction of his mailbox. It had escalated from minor frustration to deliberate confrontation, culminating in the cleverly engineered defense that had turned the tables. He realized the mailbox had become more than a protective measure, it had become a lesson in resilience, an illustration of how quiet ingenuity could overcome arrogance and intimidation. He thought about the HOA president and board members, who had visited shortly after the incident. Their faces had been a mix of shock and reluctant acknowledgement. They had tried to use authority to intimidate residents, but Jake had met them not with confrontation, but with planning, compliance, and undeniable evidence. It was a small victory, yes, but one that carried a significant message: overreach could be countered, and clever preparation could turn power on its head. In the evenings, Jake sat on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The ranch was peaceful, bathed in warm golden light. The mailbox glinted softly, an ordinary object to an outsider but a fortress to those who understood. Birds returned to the birdhouse, unaware of the camera hidden inside, while Jake sipped his coffee, savoring the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. He thought about the neighbors, who now felt empowered to protect their property without escalating conflict. The incident had created a ripple effect throughout the community. Small acts of preparation, vigilance, and intelligence were beginning to replace fear and resignation. It was proof that one person, acting thoughtfully, could influence the broader environment in profound ways. Jake also reflected on his own transformation. For years, he had been a rancher who solved practical problems, a man used to dealing with machinery, animals, and fences. But the HOA's harassment had required a different kind of solution. It demanded creativity, foresight, and a cool head. In defending a simple mailbox, Jake had demonstrated the power of strategy over force, intellect over intimidation. He allowed himself a small laugh, recalling the look on the patrol driver's face when the truck collided with the mailbox. Confidence had melted into disbelief, and arrogance had met resistance it could not overcome. That single moment had set off a chain reaction of empowerment and caution that reverberated through the neighborhood. As night settled over the ranch, Jake felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Life had returned to normal, but it carried a quiet undercurrent of security. The mailbox stood unbroken, a sentinel that had defended not just property, but principles. The HOA had been held accountable, not through public spectacle, but through careful planning, evidence, and intelligent action. For Jake Miller, the lesson was clear: sometimes, the greatest strength lies not in confrontation, anger, or force, but in patience, clever preparation, and the calm application of knowledge. By standing firm, thinking ahead, and using his skills, he had achieved what many thought impossible. He had defended himself, inspired his neighbors, and held authority accountable. The ranch, the mailbox, and the community were all better for it. And as Jake gazed at the stars beginning to dot the sky, he knew that, whatever challenges lay ahead, he had the confidence and ingenuity to meet them. The mailbox had not just survived, it had triumphed. And in that quiet triumph lay the enduring proof that cleverness, patience, and resilience could overcome even the most persistent overreach. Jake Miller set his coffee down, stood, and walked back inside the house. Outside, the mailbox gleamed softly in the moonlight, a silent guardian, a quiet victory, and a testament to the power of intelligent, thoughtful resistance. Months had passed since the incident with the HOA patrol truck, and the ranch had returned to its natural rhythm. Sunlight spilled across the fields each morning, dew sparkled on the grass, and the cattle moved lazily in their usual patterns. Yet, the air carried a subtle sense of transformation. Jake Miller's mailbox, once an ordinary receptacle for letters, now stood as a symbol of resilience, ingenuity, and quiet justice. Jake had settled into a comfortable routine, tending to his ranch duties while occasionally peeking at the hidden camera footage in the birdhouse. The HOA patrol had not returned to his property, and the neighborhood had changed in ways Jake hadn't anticipated. Residents, who had previously endured harassment in silence, now spoke in hushed tones about preparedness and vigilance. The mailbox, ordinary to the casual eye, had sparked a small but significant cultural shift. Neighbors began reinforcing their own mailboxes and documenting any irregularities with HOA inspections. Quietly, Jake became a source of guidance, not through confrontation, but by example. He shared tips on maintaining compliance while protecting one's property, demonstrating that clever planning could safeguard not just homes but dignity. The ripple effect of his actions extended far beyond the ranch. It fostered awareness and subtle empowerment throughout the community. Jake occasionally thought about the HOA president and board members. Their confidence had been shaken, replaced by caution. The patrol drivers no longer approached his property with bravado. The message was clear: overreach had consequences, and those who relied on intimidation could be countered with ingenuity and patience. Jake felt no satisfaction in revenge. His goal had never been to humiliate. The lesson had been taught quietly, effectively, and permanently. The postal inspector, who had reviewed the hidden camera footage, periodically checked in with Jake. Each visit reinforced the reality that accountability had been achieved. The HOA could no longer claim ignorance. Deliberate harassment had been documented and reported. Jake's strategic approach had turned an everyday object, a mailbox, into a beacon of justice, evidence, and preparation. As Jake walked along the driveway one evening, he reflected on the broader implications. Life often presented challenges that seemed insurmountable. Authority could be misused, rules could be bent, and systems could feel oppressive. But he had learned that even in the face of persistent overreach, clever preparation, patience, and calm intelligence could prevail. The mailbox had become a testament to this principle, a physical reminder that thoughtful action could yield meaningful results. Jake also recognized the personal growth the ordeal had fostered. For years, he had approached life pragmatically, relying on experience and skill to navigate everyday challenges. But this situation demanded a different kind of solution: strategic thinking, foresight, and subtle influence. By standing firm and acting intelligently, he had not only protected his property but had inspired an entire community to rethink how they responded to authority. Even the younger neighbors began taking note. Children who once watched the rancher with casual curiosity now asked questions about his work, his mailbox, and his approach to problem-solving. Jake realized that the lessons extended beyond property defense. They were lessons in critical thinking, resilience, and ethical cleverness. In an age where intimidation could sometimes dominate, he had shown that brains could outmatch brawn, that strategy could outmaneuver force. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Jake stood beside the mailbox, gazing at the horizon. The fields were bathed in warm, golden light, and the breeze carried the faint scent of wildflowers and hay. The mailbox, solid and unyielding, reflected the sun's rays like a small sentinel guarding the ranch and the values it represented. Jake sipped his coffee, thinking quietly. Life would continue, challenges would arise, and authority might test its boundaries again. But he was prepared. He had learned that standing one's ground required intelligence, patience, and careful planning, and that a single thoughtful action could influence far more than brute resistance ever could. As the stars began to glitter in the night sky, Jake smiled softly. The ranch was peaceful, the community was quietly stronger, and the mailbox, unassuming yet unyielding, stood as a lasting symbol of ingenuity, resilience, and quiet justice. The battle had been small, the stakes simple, but the impact was enduring. And that, Jake knew, was the true victory.